we're going to be harvesting different greens throughout the yard, which we're going to dehydrate and turn into a greens powder, which is kind of a nutritional way to help boost our meals later in the year. When it's wintertime, we have a lot less access to fresh greens. In fact, we don't have access to fresh greens. So if we want to eat stuff from our garden, we have to find a way to preserve it. So let's get into that. Now, what do we put in our greens powder? Well, one thing we put in is dandelion. And right here, I have a really good example of different types of dandelion. And it's really all the same type. But you can see here, this one is a big dandelion leaf. And it's got these points on the side. And this determines how bitter your dandelion is going to taste. So if I compare that with this one's much more jagged. It looks much more like a lion's tooth, which is what dandelion means. These are packed full of nutrients, and they make up probably a third of our greens powders. Once they're dehydrated, they lose a lot of their bitterness, and they are really good to add in sauces, spaghettis, and as well, you can even put it in smoothies. Although I wouldn't advise eating it with every meal, but it's a wonderful thing for you to try. So let's just try my experiment where it says, okay, which one is more bitter? So here's the rounded leaves. Not bad. It's not making me gag. That's a good start. Oh yeah. That's a whole nother level of bitter. So I'm going to continue trying to choke this down as we start collecting some of these more rounded leaves throughout the garden. So I've gone out and harvested all kinds of different dandelion leaves, like there's a good size one. I took a couple beet greens, because beet greens are fantastic for this. Add a little vibrancy and color. And some really teeny tiny tender dandelion, which that would actually go really well in a salad, bring in a nice fresh flavor. So again, here's some lamb's quarters right here. I've got a few of them in, but what I'm looking for now is down here. This is some of our lettuce that we planted. We planted this in April under a nice cover, and we'll explain about that next spring. And I'm just breaking pieces of it off because some of it is starting to bolt. So here's an example of a lettuce that is starting to bolt. See how it's starting to shoot up there? These leaves at the top are going to be incredibly bitter. And I only have one place where I'm going to give this. This is now a treat for the chickens and ducks. So I'm just going to pick through, get as much lettuce as I can. But all the while I'm doing this, I am inspecting for different kinds of bugs. You can find a slug that would attach itself to that. Earwigs love to just kind of crawl down. So that's why we don't do a lot of head lettuce. We tend to pick off individual leaves so they're easier to clean, easier to maintain. And when a plant is young, it is filled with a lot of more nutrients many times. So we like to get nutrient dense for anything that we can consume. So beside me is another lemon balm plant. We have this one here to help encourage things like bees to come around. And I would put that in here, but then all you would taste is lemon when you put it into the greens powder. So in front of me, I've got some kale, just in the short reach here. So here's some kale. It's not growing very strong, but hey, it'll still work for greens powder. And I've been picking away at this lettuce here, this romaine, and sometimes it's interesting to see. This garden's more of a full sun garden, and you end up with slightly different products compared to the back, which has a lot more shade. So almost there, and we'll take a quick look at our harvest, and then we'll show you how we'll process some of those things. So here's all that, the greens that we're going to use for our greens powder. You can see there's a great big variety. So all you're going to do is kind of soak it in your sink like this, just stir it around. And what you're trying to do is gently remove dirt, and as well you're trying to eliminate any bugs that might be there. Most often they're going to sink to the bottom at this point. Always continue to inspect. Normally I inspect about 3 or 4 times throughout this, and I find this is the easiest method. And then I'm going to spin it really well before I set it onto the dehydrator. So I've brought in all my different grease powder ingredients. So here's my big kale. And what I'm going to do with the kale, I'm just going to take this big stem off. They've all been washed. They're sitting on a towel right now. And I'm going to stick it into a handy dandy salad spinner. And we're going to spin some of that. Sometimes you get a salad spinner. If you're married, you might get one of those for wedding present. And you go, what am I ever going to do with that? Well, if you dehydrate your greens, like we do, we use our salad spinner all the time. That, and we eat a lot of salad because it's in the yard. So I'm just breaking them up a little bit. You don't have to. I just like to do that so it can fit in this better. If I was using the big Excalibur, I wouldn't have to be doing that. I could do whole leaves. So Sean is using the big Excalibur right now. So I'm going to use the little Ronco because I don't have to be worried about temperature control. I'm just going to keep going with this one. Now this one doesn't have a fan. It just has a heating element in the bottom. Some of them are like that. Be careful around the heating element. It will leave a nasty burn for you. And gently put them in on each one of these racks, kind of evenly distributed. So I'm going to take this first batch. It's about 3/4 full, and give it a good spin and start layering this out. Now remember, we started with a great big salad bowl, one of the family size, big family. And you'll be surprised how little we have left once we're finished the dehydrating process. So we've been able to trap all that goodness to enhance our meals. So I'm just going to go ahead and put this in and get this thing loaded up. Okay, so I'm getting to the top rack here. This is the second to the top rack, and you can see most of the lettuce leaves, dandelion leaves, they're all mixed in together. Sometimes I will just layer them one type of leaf at a time. Sometimes it helps them dehydrate better. I don't know that it's actually the case because I'm going to let this go for a little bit longer because I want to make sure they are good and crisp. There cannot be any moisture left in any of these leaves or your green powder is going to go moldy. And you don't want to have one batch turn the rest of this. You'll see how much we get out of this after we blend it, and it's a surprisingly small amount. So it takes a long time to build this up. On the other hand though, there's always stuff in the garden and in the yard that you can harvest for this. So you can, again, I've been harvesting dandelion, I've been harvesting lamb's quarters. Those are wild vegetables. Weeds to many people. I've also been harvesting lettuces, especially when the lettuce is getting very close to the end. You can do it with spinach. And as well, you can also toss in the occasional herb. But don't put too many herbs in because they will become the dominant flavor. So I have a little bit of parsley left over from the other day. And so I'm just going to sprinkle a little bit of that on the top, on the very top layer. And I give lots of space for this one because parsley is kind of curly, isn't it? And we want to make sure that it gets completely dried out before we blend this and make an addition to the 2021 greens powder to help enhance our nutrient intake in the winter. Because this is about harvesting what we have, retaining that goodness, and propelling it forward, which is a big part of homesteading. And it also helps later on in hospitality when you can share with someone and say, hey, listen, there's all kinds of goodness that we grew ourselves in this meal. So I'm going to go find a place to put the Ronco because with the Excalibur being plugged in here, I don't want to cause any kind of a short circuit of any kind and have neither one of our products dehydrate. So I'll probably go find a space for this in the basement somewhere and just let it go for about a day or two, and we'll check in with you again later. Right, so here we are back at our greens powder. It's not really an experiment because we've done this time and again, and it works pretty much every time. If you're going to do this kind of thing, the lettuces, I wouldn't advise trying to hang up. A lot of these things you do need a dehydrator for because you want to make sure they are good and crispy. So here's that parsley that's on top, good and crispy. And this is what happens to, that's the dandelion. And here's one of those little red lettuces. So I'm going to run these right through my blender. It's definitely worth it to do this. I'm not a person that consumes a lot of vegetables, and I prefer not buying my vegetables from large mega farms that monocrop. We tend to do multiple crops in our garden to help sustain and promote the soil getting better and having more nutrients within it. A lot of the large mega farms end up using a lot of chemical fertilizers, even the organic ones. The monoculture, which is growing one crop at a time, is generally not good for your soil. So we're always rotating, we're growing lots of things. And in this greens powder, again, we're harvesting some of the natural goodness that is provided in what many people just try to get rid of and throw away, which is weeds and the lettuces that are near the end of their shelf life. So I'm going to run this through my blender, and then we'll take a look at how much we have left. Okay, here we go. We've got the greens. All of them managed to pack in here pretty tight. I think this is going to be a pretty dense batch, so I'm just going to start running the blender. I don't advise you to take the lid off until well after it's done, because otherwise you're going to be breathing in this green powder. All right, so here we go. I just finished blending my greens powder. And as you can see, there's kind of this green cloud that's in the blender still. So I advise letting it settle for a good 5 to 10 minutes. Otherwise, you're just going to breathe this in, and breathing in any fine particulates probably not good for you. So let's kind of review why we're doing this. We harvested all kinds of vegetables, leafy greens, and you can even do leaves of other plants like broccoli leaves and leaves off your pea plants. Those also are really good to consume. They contain the same nutrients that are found within the parts of the plant that we generally eat. And why are we doing this? Well, here we're doing this because we do not have access to leafy greens for the entire year. So this is a way to preserve some of the goodness from our own garden area and the nutrients that are in this area within these vegetables. And then we can consume them later on in the year when we don't have access to raw. That's why we're always trying to preserve food, because we don't always have access to the raw foods. There may be other places where you have a climate where it's too dry. Maybe you have other issues where there's certain seasons where you just can't get a hold of leafy greens. This is an excellent way to preserve them. It's not as good as raw, obviously, but it is a good way. And at the same time, if you're not a big fan of vegetables, you can sneak these in to a lot of foods. I am not a huge fan of a lot of vegetables, especially the bitter ones. And the bitter ones are often the ones that are better for you. So I can put this into my eggs, make it into an eggs Florentine. I can add it to spaghetti sauce. In fact, we often add large quantities into our spaghetti sauce to, one, enhance flavor and texture, and as well, it gives that extra. It's like adding a big salad into your spaghetti sauce to help enhance the nutrient intake. So in a few minutes after this is settled, we're going to pour it out, and we're just going to see how much we got out of that big mound of leafy greens that we had picked. So this time I'm going to use the metal canning funnel that we have, and I'm just going to pour it off into this 1 cup measure just to see how we did. Let's just give this a little bit of a tap to get the stuff off the side. Remember, all of this is good for you. And this is actually a really dense batch, probably because we had the parsley and so much dandelion. But as you can see, we have about 3/4 of a cup, which is about a little above average, maybe a little less than that. But let's compare that with the bowl that the leafy greens came out of. So we can see we've condensed a lot of our nutrients. Now this is an ongoing project. This is not something, oh look, I got leafy greens. I've already started the 2021 leafy green powder, and so I'm just going to add this into this batch, and then we'll seal it up until the next time when we look around the gardens and go, okay, it's time. I probably could have done twice, maybe 3 times as much of the leafy greens as we did. However, you got to work with the dehydrators that you have. Otherwise, you're going to be eating a lot of salad for the next couple of days. All right. So this is the procedure. So you pick the leafy greens, wash and rinse them out, pat them really good dry, put them in your dehydrator, pull them out when they're crispy, run them through the blender, put them in your jar. Pretty simple for a way to preserve vegetables and leafy greens and the nutrients within them for a time when you just don't have access to them.